Eventually, we're going to get to our scripture passage this morning, which is found in Matthew's Gospel, the end of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, starting in verse 31. And so if you want to find a Bible and kind of stick your finger in there, you can do that. Hold on to that a little bit. We will get there shortly. But I wanted to just back up and remind us of where we were last week. We began a series that will continue through Advent that we are calling When God Becomes Homeless. And last week we talked about some things that honestly confused me a little bit and have continued to swirl around in my brain as I've thought through this whole idea of a homeless God. It's a bit troubling, even off-putting. But this idea that God's plan, the God of the universe, the omniscient, all-powerful, eternal Logos, creator of the universe, when that God decided that it was time to save humanity, God's salvific plan, God's idea of implementing power to save all of creation and humanity was a little bit strange. God decided to leave home and not just appear somewhere in splendor and in power, but God chose to kind of leave the splendor and power of the heavenly realm behind and to one degree or another become homeless, take on this frail human flesh, clothe God's eternal glory with flesh, and not just come as a simple and flawed human, but to come as an infant. An infant, as we know, that was conceived out of wedlock to a young couple who the night they actually gave birth to God were themselves homeless and living in a barn. And then soon after, of course, we know the story that Jesus was born. The three of them had to flee as refugees hundreds of miles south to Egypt to escape a vicious king and his plan to commit infanticide. And so the question is, if Jesus was God, if Jesus was the omniscient, all-powerful, eternal Logos, why was this his plan? Why not do things a whole lot differently? Again, why not just manifest yourself in a way that was undeniably divine? And why didn't God just set God's self up somewhere where God could make a decision here or there or take the reins of control and just change things, make things the way that God would want them so that the kingdom of heaven could be known and realized on earth? Instead, God decided to take on human flesh, and the question could be, well, God, if that's what you're going to do, then couldn't you at least be born legitimately? Or when you were born, couldn't you be born in a nice house? Or if you did have to deal with a crazy king who wanted to kill infants, why didn't you stop and confront him and put an end to it there? What was God communicating to us in the very version, the very way that God chose to reveal God's power to us in Christmas? Why was this God's liberation plan? It's a strange start. It's confusing to us because we are told and we learn from very early on what power is. We even learn from our understanding of the scriptures that God has a strong arm, that the Lord is mighty, that God comes in fire and wind, and even through the actions of the Hebrew armies. We learn very quickly what power is and who has power and who doesn't have power, and those who have power are the ones that can make change. But God's power, as we look at God revealed in Jesus, really, if we're honest, looks a whole lot more like powerlessness. Brokenness. Not a very powerful plan. And when God did, in Christ, execute power, employ power, it was to do things like touch bleeding women, or to give sight to the blind, or instead of churning up dangerous waters, stilling them, and walking upon them, feeding the masses with food that was shared by others. And when people came to this powerful God throughout God's strange plan of liberation and said, we want to be a part of this movement, The response that Jesus had for them was saying things like, well, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but if you want to follow me, you'll have no place to lay your head. Really, a homeless God? That was God's plan to save us, to bring healing and hope to humanity and creation. God became homeless, and in the end of his ministry was betrayed, abandoned, tortured, and crucified as a traitor. Humiliating. In comparison to what we think of as power and dominance today, our God was, in the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer that we shared last week, our God is a powerless God. What does that say to us? What do we learn from that? What do we do with that? Well, what some of us do, and what myself and other theologians have even attempted to do in the past, is to try to shoehorn God back into that mechanistic understanding of power. Make God fit into our understanding of what it means to be God. That's one thing that we can do, but instead, I believe that this season of Advent is a time when we are supposed to sit and wait and learn and to allow God's definition of power to deconstruct ours and to help us to rearrange what it means to be whole and healed and home, to reconstruct and redefine power according to Jesus. And to understand what that salvific power is all about, the first step for each one of us in this journey is to be honest about and to begin with our own feelings of internal worth, powerlessness, and homelessness. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a young woman who came to my office, a young professional. She was, from outward appearances, doing quite well. She shared with me that things were well with her family and her profession, and really she didn't have a whole lot to complain of compared to issues that she was seeing on TV or tragedies that she knew that others were having to work through. She was not at all in a horrible situation, but she said, I just got to tell you, there's this low-grade sadness that seems to just buzz in the back of my heart, and I don't know what to do about it. And as I listened to her and shared my experiences, shared with her my own struggles of being human and growing up in this imperfect but beautiful body and world that we find ourselves in, I said, inevitably, the gaps in our lives, the weaknesses, the unfulfilled hopes and expectations become too evident and prominent to deny. This woman said back to me, maybe we all just need to understand that no matter what other people look like, no matter what their outward appearance or what we think of them, perhaps need to start realizing that everybody you see is struggling. Everybody is struggling. And I said, yeah, that's a good way to put it. You see, in our American Christianity, that's a tough kind of way to lead. Everyone is struggling. We tend to think a little bit more in terms of victory and salvation. But really, that's our unique perspective. If you were to grow up in another part of the world, say, and were raised in the Buddhist faith, the first of the four noble truths of Buddhism is that life is suffering. And then you go from there. We, especially on the other end of Thanksgiving, are instead feeling fairly guilty or not thankful if we spend too much time talking about or ruminating our own sadness or suffering. We're to be celebrating. We're to be appreciative. And, I think the big part of growing up for all of us, not just in life but in our faith, is realizing that these two are not mutually exclusive, that we hold these two in tension. To, yes, acknowledge that there are many things to be thankful for, but to not do away with or ignore the low-grade sadness that also exists in the midst of that thankfulness. A big part of growing up in our faith is understanding the depths of God's knowledge for us. That even if we don't know how to talk about our sadness, our anxiety, our struggles, our worries, even if we are encouraged either internally or externally not to talk about our struggles, our worries, our sadness, our anxieties, God is well acquainted with them. God knows the thoughts, God knows the wonders, God knows the sadness. And God is so deeply in love with each one of us that God knows in order to bring wholeness and healing, God must become broken and weak and homeless. God's very life says to us, I am with you. Not just theologically, not just in thought, not just in feeling, but I am with you. I am a God who also struggles. And just knowing that is a comfort. I struggle too, God says, and I will never, ever leave you. When we can see and understand power in that light and that definition, it gives us the permission to quit hiding or denying our bruises, our struggles, or believing that we must perform in one way or another to become worthy, and to know that we are simply loved, as are all of our struggling brothers and sisters around us. All of us are loved, forgiven, included, because our broken and homeless friend is also our God. That is the message of Christmas that you don't see often written on Christmas cards. A broken and homeless God meets us in our brokenness and homelessness. And in sharing that part of ourselves with God and with others, we find comfort. One of the ways that God meets us very practically and pragmatically is to bring this healing, to bring this sense of home and connection through interacting and caring for each other, and perhaps most particularly with those who are experiencing poverty and homelessness firsthand. So here we go, Matthew chapter 25, verses 30 through 40. Jesus is gathered with his disciples, and he's talking about the second coming, when Christ is going to come back, and what will happen at that point. And even in this understanding, this description of the second coming and the coming of the kingdom of God, Jesus again turns things upside down a little bit and redefines power and righteousness. Starting in verse 34, Jesus says, "Then the king will come and say to those on his right, 'Come, you who receive good things from my Father, inherit the kingdom that was prepared for you before the world began. I was hungry, and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothes to wear. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' And then those who are righteous replied to him, 'Lord, wait a minute. When did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you as a stranger and welcome you, or naked and give you clothes to wear? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And then the king will reply to them, 'I assure you that when you have done it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you have done it for me and to me.'" Friends, this is the word of the Lord. That makes it both profound and a little bit easier, I think, at the same time. I'm reminded of those people who lived lives like this. One of my heroes of the faith, many whom you know, Mother Teresa, who founded the Sisters of Charity, working among the poor in Calcutta. She was an Albanian woman who, in taking her vows, moved to India to live among the poorest of the poor, the poorest caste or class in India, the untouchables, people who, many of them, found their way and their food and their furniture and such by scavenging through the dumps in Calcutta. Teresa lived among them with her friends and other nuns. She became their friends, listened to them, touched them, cared for them, held them as they died. She was an amazing saint. She also struggled from depression what we learned later in her memoirs, and going for literally years at a time when she felt like she couldn't connect with God through her prayers. But she always said this. She said that she would connect with Christ when he came again. I connect with Christ when he comes again. But when she talked about Christ coming again, she wasn't talking about the end of time. She wasn't talking about the second coming in the way that we think of. This is what she was talking of. She says, "We did not recognize him when once more Christ came in the distressing disguise of the hungry woman, the lonely man, the homeless child. For God has identified himself with the hungry and the sick and the naked. The homeless hunger not only for bread, but for love, for care, to be somebody to someone. Nakedness, not of clothing only, but nakedness for the compassion that very few people give to the unknown." Couldn't that be said for each one of us and to each one of us? See, one of the things that I think we need to also deconstruct at this time is this definition of homelessness, what it means to be homeless. Because I think each one of us, in one way or another, in our lack of connection, our nakedness, our fears, our hunger, are homeless. And when we can recognize in each one of us and those around us, not other people that have their life together or that are more perfect than us, but other people who are struggling and homeless just like us, it's a lot easier to connect with them in that space, right? But God comes to us in a special and poignant way through those who can't even fake it, those who don't have the ability to even afford a roof over their heads. The total number of people experiencing homelessness counted last January at the annual point-in-time count, which some of you were a part of in both Jackson and Wyandotte counties. The number of people experiencing homelessness was about 1,798 people. It was a little bit of an increase over 2017, even though the number of homeless veterans decreased significantly in the Kansas City area because of intentional work with some of the organizations that Second works with. 1,800 people in our city that we know of, at least, not counting many of the youth who find ways to hide or to sleep on other people's couches or abandoned spaces. There are, we know, the chronic homeless, many of whom struggle with mental illness. 60% of people who are experiencing homelessness are staying in shelters, about 30% of them sleeping under bridges, various places they can find shelter. But the fact of the matter is, most people who experience homelessness are only in that state for 3 to 6 months before they make their way back out again. The fact of the matter is, homelessness, even at that degree, is not that far away from every one of us and each of us. It's interesting when you spend time with the homeless what their backgrounds are, where they've been, where their stories have led. As much as we protect against it, as much as we even fear it, I wonder if experiencing a week or two of homeless might not be the worst thing in the world for most Americans. Because when you can't afford a roof over your head, you don't worry so much about whether you've got the latest iPhone or what you're going to get for Christmas or how you're going to arrange next week's meals. There's no space for pedigree or definitions of success. You are brought to a place where you need to rely on the humanity of others. You're left not only with pain and humility, but also with learned wisdom and insight and empathy. I remember a story that a good friend of mine, a woman who used to spend a couple of nights a month with homeless people, sleeping in a certain part of the city where they gathered on a regular basis in the evenings, a sheltered place where they put down their cardboard and sleep together for warmth and a little bit of camaraderie at night. And she would go there a couple of times a month just to be with them, to sit with them, to get to know them by name and talk with them, not necessarily offer anything of significance besides friendship and conversation. And one night, around this time of year, she was there talking with them, and many of the folks who were experiencing homelessness at that time had laid down for the night, who had closed their eyes, weren't asleep, but were trying to get there. And she was still talking with one gentleman who was awake and sitting up. And just at that time, a person walked by on their way home, and you could tell that person was prepared because they made eye contact with the one homeless gentleman who was still up and handed him an envelope and said, "Happy Thanksgiving." And inside the envelope was about $200 in 20s. And the first thing this homeless gentleman did was quickly nudged those around him who he knew actually weren't sleeping and handed each one of them a $20 bill and said, "Happy Thanksgiving, Happy Thanksgiving, Happy Thanksgiving." You see, when we can break down those little barriers that we put between ourselves and other broken people that live around us, the homeless that are right here in our room, it makes it a little easier to step past and to break that silly, insignificant boundary that separates us from those that are experiencing material homelessness. And when we do so, we recognize that there's not that big of a gap. In fact, we might have things to learn ourselves in making contact and reaching out and extending grace and humanity. None of us are responsible for ending homelessness. None of us are even responsible for ending one person's homelessness, but we are responsible for seeing in our homeless brother and sister not a problem or a nuisance or even a stranger, but a brother and a sister and a child of God who is worthy of love and respect and attention. And even if we don't have anything we can give physically to someone who is experiencing homelessness, we can give our attention, we can give our respect, we can share the same dignity that we would want extended to us. We can and we should share that tiny piece of love that our God in Christ has shown to each one of us. Jim Paulson, who's a deacon here at Second, who was a part of the first service, shared with me afterwards that this time of year he starts to take a different route to work every day so he can kind of connect with and see different people who are experiencing homelessness, and he tries to have something to give away, a little something, whether it's a few dollars or a bottle of water. And handful of gentlemen that he got to know, and after doing this for a couple of years, he stopped at one window and rolled his window down at one corner, and after he handed the bottle of water to the gentleman, he said, "Hey, what's your name?" And the gentleman was taken back and stood there for some time, and he said, "I got to tell you, no one's asked me that question before." Ilia Delio is a Franciscan scientist and a theologian, and he talks about the scandal of the downward mobility of God's incarnation. The scandal of the downward mobility of the incarnation. He says Advent challenges us to take that seriously and to allow it to rearrange our priorities. He says the problem of immigrants, the problem of welfare recipients, of the incarcerated, of the mentally ill, of the disabled, this is actually not a problem at all. It is a statement. It is a statement about the incarnation. For when we deny our relatedness to the poor, the weak, the simple, the unlovable, we then are the ones who are defining who is loved and who is family over against God and God's broad definition. And we can then allow our caution and our fear to dictate the way we spend our time, the way we spend our money, the way we spend our attention, preserving the boundaries and the privacy that establish old notions of power. Delio says that in sealing ourselves off from others, we seal ourselves off from God. And when we reject God in the homeless neighbor, we reject the very love that can and does often heal us. And so what do? Well, the simple thing to do, and the great thing about being a part of a church like this, is that you can get in touch with any one of these organizations that we've got a relationship with, that we give resources to, that we share. You can talk to people like Jill Hodge, who help get together a group of people once a month to go cook food and prepare at cross lines. You can get in touch with any one of these organizations. You can be praying and asking God to help you to be a person who recognizes in yourself your own homelessness and your brokenness, recognizes and is brave enough to reach out and to encourage, support, compliment those around you who are struggling. And then prepare yourself so that you have something to do, something to give in order to reach out, to build a bridge and to give a gift to somebody else. It's funny because I learned just a couple of years ago that there are people that are far more organized than me who around this time of year will have an extra gift, kind of a generic gift that they'll have wrapped in their purse or in their car for no one in particular, except for the fact that if someone they weren't expecting to get a gift from gives them a gift, then you can reach into your purse and say, oh, I got you something too, and you're already prepared to have this exchange so it's not awkward. So wouldn't it be nice if we also prepared ourselves on a daily basis during this season to be able to reach out to someone with a compliment, to be prepared to reach out to someone and to say a kind word to a broken person, a struggling person that's next to you, or as you're driving down the road or walking down the road or scootering with a bird down the road, you would have something that you could give and connect with somebody else, and your brokenness and their brokenness, your homelessness and their homelessness could create home together. And so that's what we're going to do. As the choir sings our reflective song this morning, I'm going to invite you guys to come forward, and I've got some helpers to come up here. This is what we're going to do. We're going to just build, starting at this end, aisles on either side, and then at this table on either side, and at that table on either side. We're just going to build little homeless packets, big Ziploc gallon bags, and some granola, some hand warmers, some socks, some wet wipes, and then some information. One of the best pieces. Go ahead, guys, start arranging it up there. Information on where people can get additional help and support. So what I want you to do is, as we're singing this song, Here I Am, Lord, I would encourage you to come forward, put together a few packets that you can take for yourself, or maybe you want to give to somebody else that you know, that maybe their line of travel takes them past people who are experiencing homelessness, so that we can give gifts to each other. And then at the end, there's also a little piece of paper, and I would encourage you to take that maybe while you're sitting in the pew, just write a personal note from one beloved child of God to another, or Merry Christmas, or whatever you would like to say to personalize that note a little bit from Second Presbyterian Church. So as the choir sings, let's come forward and make some gifts and build some bridges to connect with our homeless friends.